sort of hybrid networks. Just so you know, it's a little bit what we do at Asymmetrica, which is I decided that actually there was a place to do this professionally. I had started doing some of this work as an academic. As you know, because of my ties with Latin America, with Venezuela, I cut my teeth, really, so to speak, in this some time ago in Colombia, traveling around, meeting people from the FARC and the paramilitaries. I traveled a lot around and met a lot of people affected by what is, as you know, the longest running war on the planet. And part of their DDR process, so understood what brought the fighters in, what brought them out, and all that. Continued on with doing research into the drug trafficking via Venezuela as well, and the degree to which the government is complicit, which is not a secret because the Treasury Department has all sorts of sanctions on various individuals, and then also into the Middle East and the Levant and examining that. By the time I got through with sort of analyzing those connections, I got sort of tapped on the shoulder to get more involved with doing things with the Defense Department and the State Department and what we call the Asymmetric Warfare Group, and analyzing what they called crime terror pipelines. I didn't realize I was doing crime terror pipelines until I was informed of this fact. And it's very interesting. There's quite a few people working in this space. If this is an area that interests you, it's what we might call a growth area professionally, in that there is a growing understanding. Well, there are two things going on. First of all, is sanctions are more effective, or there are more sanctions, more pressure to end state sponsorship. There is greater growth of illicit trade, funding it. We have more people being involved. On the one hand, on the other hand, there's more of an awareness that this is a growing problem and that therefore we need people to do something about it. Put all my cards on the table. I worked as academically. I'm also working on a book. At Asymmetrica, we do this from sort of a business perspective, that businesses kind of see the problem, understand aspects about it because they see it as a business problem, but don't understand what to do about it as a security problem. We or our government partners do. So we try and develop sort of win-win situations in between the public entities and private entities. And I will flesh that out. So this will, if that sounds odd, I'm hoping it'll become clearer as the talk goes on. Okay, so what is illicit trade? Here we're using a map with that's based on drugs, but the reason for that is that a lot of the routes, when drugs is the major illicit trade everybody knows, everybody thinks about, the first thing you say, smuggling. It's still the most lucrative illicit trade, but also a lot of the routes where drugs go, there's also the routes to transport other stuff. Not exactly, but the degree of correlation is very, very high. That's why we call them pipelines, because once you have, if you already have a shipper or a trucker or a money launderer or a lawyer whom you trust, you tend to pile in people, drugs, weapons along the same route. So since the drug smuggling routes are the ones that are best understood, because it's the ones we've developed, spent the most resources on understanding, it's not 100% overlap, but it's strongly enough to understand where a lot of the problem is going. The State Department that I work a lot with, because I'm very involved with a group called the INL, International Narcotics and Law Enforcement. The head of that, there's a guy called David Luna, the director of the anti-crime programs, is the head of a task force on charting illicit trade for the OECD. I am a subgroup leader on that. We're basically charting what are the problems with illicit trade and what are the threats posed by it, what are the drivers for the OECD, which basically drafts policy recommendations for 34 of the wealthiest countries, right? We're already 2 years into it. Quite frankly, I think it's going to be another 2 years. This is a very, very slow process. But it's very worthwhile because it understands that illicit trade is a business like all others, and therefore it has a policy component that drives it, what makes it possible. So trying to understand that. Anyway, so the State Department says that it's 10 to 15% of GGP, which is gross global product, right? Gross domestic product when it's a country, when it's the whole world, it's gross global product. Now, nobody really knows. I think that number's bandied about, that percentage is bandied about too much. It might be too high. I'll tell you that according to the World Bank, the gross global product is 75 trillion, which means that if illicit trade is 10% of that, that's 7.5 trillion or up to $11 trillion a year, which is higher than any other estimate. So on the one hand, they give you the perspective, then on the other hand, you get numbers from $650 billion to $1.3 trillion. The problem is nobody really knows, because the whole point is it's covert, it's illicit, right? The money is hidden also by very big banks. It's not just, you have ways people barter the money. You can move the money through hawalas, which is a very popular Middle Eastern way of banking. It's like they move money in a system of credit across centers, which is basically untraceable to the international banking system. And trade-based money laundering, which we'll get into. So it's very hard to understand what the proceeds are. At any rate, it's huge and it's growing. And as I personally work on these issues, every time I'm working on a case and trying to, map the network, you realize that, holy cow, this is much bigger even than I realized. It affects every industry, every single industry. I mean, oils, we think of drugs, we think of weapons, we think of humans. Those are big ones. But there's also illicit trade in tobacco, which is actually the subgroup that I lead at the OECD, which is always interesting because everybody hates tobacco. But it is actually the most profitable illicit trade of an otherwise legal good, right? So the biggest one is narcotics, but that's illegal anyway. But this is a legal industry that smuggling it, because of a variety of reasons, some of them policy, some of them because of the anti-tobacco and the taxation, have made it so profitable and so low risk that it's the single biggest moneymaker for smugglers of an otherwise legal industry. Profit margin. You have pharmaceuticals. We've seen car parts. I spoke with recently at a conference with a very big German automaker. It's like, you have no idea, the cars in Africa, they're crashing all over the place because people think that, they go to get their car repaired and they put in what they say are our parts and they're not our parts. We've seen fake food, counterfeit eggs. I mean, you would think that eggs are cheap enough or abundant enough that you wouldn't need to copy them or counterfeit them, but you'd be wrong, clearly. I don't know, I'm not exactly sure how this happened, how you make a counterfeit egg, but they're out there, okay? So anything that's legal is falsified. So when we're working on something, we always have to try and separate the white, the black, and the gray. So white means, in sort of security parlance, means it's all legal, your legitimate industry, so to speak. The black are your totally bad guys. But in reality, most of the cases are really some sort of gray. Even when you're working with a corporate client, like as I said, the corporations are saying, my God, if our cars are crashing, this is a big problem for us, clearly, right? So from their perspective, it's a brand integrity problem. From a business perspective, 70% of the book value of any company is the value of their brand, okay? So if you think that that company's products are going to kill you and you stop buying them, you've got a major problem on your hands. You also have the problem that these criminals are eating your markets. So businesses care about this, but they see it from one perspective. Governments care about it because it's giving money to guys who are buying guns. and taking over countries and torturing women and children and all of that, or plotting terrorist attacks. But by bringing the two together, which is what I'll discuss at the end of the talk, you can see, you can form a partnership and get a lot more information and develop much savvier strategies rather than just what we call in the military the kinetic ones of shoot 'em up. Okay? So in reality, a lot of it is gray. You know, it'll turn out that the shippers that ship for the largest corporations are also either wittingly or unwittingly also shipping for the criminals. We have seen former employees of major corporations go to work for criminal organizations. Like, wow, I don't understand how this trade is growing so fast. They're challenging us, they're eating our market. Guess what? It's your former director who has joined them. That's why they understand the business. The money will move through things that are otherwise legitimate. So that's the gray. And the challenge is to try and develop solutions. You know, I'm a dyed-in-the-wool capitalist, okay? So you want to devise solutions that keeps business running effectively without, and yet just gets rid of the criminal element and degrades the funding, right? We want to degrade, disrupt, dismantle, destroy, all those Ds. The DoD guys love all that jargon, right? The criminal networks, while keeping the economy and jobs and industry ticking along. So, as I said, it's a loss to industry, government, and communities, because communities lose out because you have a lot of violence. They lose out through the weapons, the women, the enslavement of women and children, child labor, the human trafficking, as you know, and they're basically sort of indentured servitude, and the enabling of this is also through corruption. So we're also involved when you're tackling this thing, like at the task force, there's a big component of anti-money laundering, anti-corruption, trying to reinforce international cooperation on investigations of corruption, because guess what? You can't move major quantity of product unless you've got someone on your payroll. You know, once you see lots of stuff moving, you're like, well, the guy at the port is clearly at the payroll, or the government official stamping the papers. Okay, so it needs that sort of multilateral approach, right? And the game is obviously lots of money to criminality, violence, extremism, and corruption. Okay, here are some of the industries. As I said, it's very hard to know. Cigarettes are not in here because nobody likes, they tend to go under counterfeiting. But they're not actually all in there. The other thing that you're seeing, which is kind of unique to cigarettes that doesn't happen with other products, well, sort of does, actually. Other counterfeit goods like consumer products, there is something similar. You have your counterfeit and your contraband. So counterfeiting is a savvy business model because you're basically piggybacking on someone else's work, right? The reason why you want to copy a Gucci or a Louis Vuitton or a Marlboro is because they're iconic brands. Everybody wants a Gucci or a Louis Vuitton or a Marlboro. So, and you just make it on the cheap. So brand owners know that every time they have a solid brand, the counterfeiters are coming. There's another thing, so they send out their lawyers to go chase the containers and go to court. The problem is the criminal networks are now moving into something else that are called, in tobacco it's called, as I said, I'm leading that group in the OECD, it's called illicit whites, which is, here's an example of illicit whites. I have a license to produce Vanessa brand cigarettes, okay? And I pay my taxes, and I have all my documentation, and I'm allowed to produce 10 million cigarettes as Vanessa cigarettes. Except Vanessa cigarettes produces 50 million cigarettes, and I pay the taxes on the 10, sell them legitimately, then ship the other 40 million elsewhere, out of state, to another place where they're more expensive. The UK, Ireland, where I'm going to make a huge profit margin. The problem is, in order to get my product there, I'm using smugglers, which are criminals. And the people who sell them are very often either linked to the IRA, linked to Islamic State claims to hate cigarettes, but they're actually making money off the taxation of the transportation, which is classic. Everybody does that. Hezbollah owns the illicit cigarette trade in Latin America, basically. I mean, Hamas is in it too, but it's really Hezbollah. So it's a major issue. Now, there's a classic example of a gray industry, right? Because Vanessa Tobacco is legitimate for the 10 million. It's only once I start smuggling and crossing lines on bits that are not paid that there's the crime. So you have to be very, working in this space is interesting because, especially in the gray, because you have to figure out where exactly things become crime terror pipelines. So we talk about a threat convergence. That's a mapping of how things are connected. Those are people connections, right? So there's various studies in DoD studies about, you know, degrees of separation, how much, if you know, what we call network analysis, which is if we take your phone book and see who are the people you know. Well, and let's say you're a narcotics smuggler, okay? I mean, you're somebody of interest, not just, you know, there's a reason why they're looking at your phone book. We hope, though maybe not. Then they see how many people that you know are terrorists, how many people are criminals, and they found that, and how it connects to other networks. It turns out that there's a growing tendency over time for these networks to flatten, for people to get to know each other, and to connect through certain strategic nodes. There are some people that are considered the kingpins, it turns out, are actually major connectors through which information can flow and through which things can change and different transactions can be effected quickly. Now, the reason for understanding this is when you do an analysis and you develop a strategy to counter something, to counter a route, to counter a criminal network, you want to do what we call in wargaming an analysis of the center of gravity, right? What are the nodes? What is it that they need to do in order to carry on this illicit trade? And then what are the critical capabilities? And for every critical capability, there's a critical vulnerability. And so what are those people, or what are those things that we can affect? Some things you want to do, but you can't do. Or there is no political will to do because they have another partnership, they have another relationship, there are other interests at stake. We're all familiar with that. Okay? But it's considered a threat convergence because you have the worst of everything. You have the worst of terrorism, you have the worst of criminality, and they're starting to act more and more like each other, right? Somebody said to me on Facebook recently, they're like, oh, those terrible people in the Islamic State with all the beheadings, terrible savages over there. And I said, well, wait a minute, they're also doing it in Mexico, right across the border. The cartels, and you can go online if you know where to look, and find videos of, you know, not just the beheading, but, you know, the person begging for their life, the beheading, and the dismemberment, all in one video. So in a way, you see criminal networks appropriating the strategies of terrorist groups to message, right? To inspire fear. And there's a reason for that. And you know, maybe it's not one of the more popular things I say, but terrorism it's about speech ultimately. You're ultimately trying to get people to view things your way, to affect political change, and to terrorize them, to bend them. Whereas criminality was supposed to be covert, right? That's the traditional thinking. Terrorists want to intimidate and flip the political order, which is why messaging is so important to them. Criminals just want to get on with their business and be left alone, and therefore they don't want to, they want to stay under the radar. Except they're not. They are doing exactly the same strategies, or very similar strategies, to say, we're here, get out of our way, and you know, we're the rulers now. They also use things like you see in Mexico, they'll use symbolism of patron saints, so even religiosity, right? That we have a patron saint of the cartel, and they'll paint it on the walls, or they'll use national heroes. So they use symbolism the way that terror groups some do as well. So I'm not saying they're exactly the same, and you can't use exactly the same strategies, but there's another way of looking at it, that power is power. And what everybody's after is power. And in some ways, sometimes, you know, it's sometimes a mistake to talk about it too much as grievance or a you know, religion. In some cases, if you strip out some of the talk about religion and some of the talk about other things, it's basically a lot of the mechanisms look alike. So it's one of the things you want to consider. The other aspect is positive externalities. They create positive externalities for each other. In economics, it means something, when I do something and it makes the environment better for somebody else, easier for them to accomplish what they want to accomplish. That's an economic term. So basically, when terrorists are, you know, bombing buildings or sucking up the state's resources and making people afraid to take action, to take certain action, you're using those resources, it opens up the ability for criminals, it sucks up the governance resources and makes life easier for criminals. Criminals have, by the way, also been used in counterterrorism or for other things. I mean, you might even know the mafia was used during World War II. And, you know, the governments have made very strange accommodations along the way in order to fight whatever is the enemy of the day. And alliances shift. This is no news to you guys. But also when criminals corrupt officials to let goods go by, you know, to stamp things, and they have very well trained and very effective shippers or money launderers, it makes it much easier for terrorists to accomplish their goals too. So the existence of each makes the existence of the other, or the activities of the other, easier. So not only do they imitate each other, they also facilitate each other, and that is why the threat is considered convergent. Okay, and that is why it's being considered as a very serious threat. In 2011, the White House issued a, well, whatever. For what it's worth, okay, the White House issued a statement that transnational organized crime, TOC, T-O-C, transnational organized crime, put a C in front of it, it always means counter whatever it is you're talking about. Counterterrorism, CT, counter-narcotics, CNs, CTOC, counter-transnational organized crime. So that transnational organized crime was a tier 1 national security problem, and it needed to be addressed almost at the same range as terrorism. In our daily experience in tackling this and developing strategies, it's very hard to get proper enforcement action on illicit trade or smuggling of goods unless you can link it to something else. So if we see that the same network is trafficking narcotics or is involved in facilitating a terrorist group, that is like bingo, now you've got enforcement. Which is why information sharing is key. UN transnational, and then UN transnational organized crime. It's also, you know, the UN also considers it a threat, and there's something that's supposed to take more seriously and collaborate. And the UN Center for Countering Terrorism is now holding, you know, greater talks and being briefed on transnational organized crime as a counterterrorism strategy. Okay, and that is because of the issue of material support, which means that because of all this, from a policy perspective, the concept of material support for terrorism has been expanded. You don't have to necessarily give the money to the group, but if they are, you know, if your product, if you're not doing due diligence on where your product is going and it ends up going to somebody that you know is doing illicit trafficking, you can get in hot water a lot easier now than you could 3 years ago. Okay, so there's definitely an expansion. That's one of the reasons I was saying it's a growth area. Criminal groups, they use, as I said, the similar fixers and facilitators smuggle drugs. We have seen stuff moving through the, there's a lot of stuff moving through the port of Latakia, which is in Syria. and the people there have links with all sides of the conflict. All sides of the conflict are making money through the goods there, U.S.-Mexico border and Western Sahel. So this networks, we call them flat stateless networks, because they have the benefit of, and I'll link the two, right? So flat because they're fracturing, and some people consider this as a consequence of counter-terrorist strategy, that if you take out the command and control, these networks very savvily control their information, and everybody only talks to like one person above them who they only know by a code name, on a throwaway cell phone. And there isn't like the big honcho feeding the information down like you see in The Godfather. Like, that's not happening anymore because everybody knows about it, including the CIA, the DEA, and everybody else. So they don't work that way anymore. So they're flatter, and they move their alliances shift faster because they share information through these watering holes of these fixers and facilitators. And they hang out in the same bars and share information. So they act, and then being stateless is an advantage in some ways because you can't like sanction them the same way you can sort of something you can't send your diplomats to put pressure on their government if they cross borders. That's another reason why countering their source of funding is one of the few effective strategies. But having said that, they also use borders for arbitrage and protection, right? Because one of the challenges is, they're like, well, first of all, for arbitrage is goods are cheaper in one country, you take it from where it's cheap to produce to where it's expensive to buy. And one of your good friends is a great big fat taxation policy because you're not paying the taxes if you're a criminal, right? So the people who don't pay the taxes, you view that as a profit margin, okay? So, and even if you sell just a little bit under that, then they, that's still profit for them. So that's what I mean by arbitrage. So when you look at a map and you're considering an industry and you're looking at goods and you look at where the prices and the tax differentials are, you can predict the flows, always. And protection, right? Because you need the local law enforcement to go get them, right? One of the examples is oil smuggling, which is the funding of ISIS. They've talked about, maybe $2 million a day. The first time I heard about this was in the FARC in Colombia, punching holes in the pipelines, or just threatening to blow them up. But that's just classic terrorism, right? Colombia has big oil interests. The foreigners had big oil, foreign oil companies had big interests. They put bombs and say, we'll blow them up unless you pay us a ransom. But they're just good old-fashioned, punch a hole in the pipeline, fill tanks, sell them. You see the same thing also in Mexico. Pemex has big problems with oil smuggling. Weak border security between Turkey, Syria, and Iraq. You see that a lot. We all know about the problems with that border. It's trying to get the Turks to enforce more seriously. They've got so many different interests with so many different sides. Their path forward is unclear. Much to the frustration of many other countries, but everybody's got to do what's best for them. I mean, that's what a country's supposed to do. You want your country doing what's best for you. But they basically, even before they were taking over the oil fields effectively and acting as a proto-government, they made a lot of their money from smuggling the oil out of Kurdistan and selling it into Turkey, where they found willing buyers. Once again, if you don't have the infrastructure costs and you're not paying taxes, then it's all that money, all that margin is yours for the taking. I'm sure some of you have seen this map about the oil fields. Now they control them, so the smuggling is even easier, even bigger. Okay, human smuggling versus trafficking. That's a real picture. That's a real photograph of a woman who's been tattooed with the barcode by her owners, by her captors. So the difference between human smuggling versus human trafficking, do you guys know? Yeah? The difference, right? Smuggling, you want it to go. trafficking, you didn't want to go, you're being sold, you're being forced to work. Often people who want to be smuggled, who want to leave, escaping poverty, violence, and everything else, or or just looking for a better future, want to end up being trafficked. They take their passports away, end up. Prostitution of women is still wildly profitable. It's still the most profitable aspect of human trafficking. The interesting thing about the sale of humans, as opposed to the sale of goods, is that you can resell a human over and over and over and over again, right? And therein lies the tragedy, right? I mean, well, there are a lot of aspects to the tragedy, but that's the business model, right? Right, you can smuggle other goods. One of the concerns, and so when you get into discussing the space of human trafficking and human smuggling, you can kind of tell where people are coming from, right? Because NGOs are very concerned, or you have people who are very concerned about the tragic aspect of it, that you need to tackle it at its root, improve the lives of the people where they're coming from, that they're mistreated by the coyotes, and then you get sort of rabid, security people who talk about the fact that these migrants could be smuggling anything else. There is evidence of that. There's quite a bit of evidence of that. Smuggling people is actually hard. Usually people start smuggling with other things because people run away and they bang on doors and they make noise and they're harder to hide than a packet of cocaine. One of the things when you look at a map and you're looking at trafficking routes of something moving, usually the sign that that network is moving people along with whatever good that you're looking at is when it takes really circuitous routes. When you want to go from point A to point B or C, and instead it's like from here to there to there to here to here to there to there to where to back and whatever, and you're like, I don't know, why couldn't you just get the cigarettes to market faster? Because because people are on the same transportation network. Not always, but it's a good indicator. There's a lot more hopping around because there are like different passports and different tickets being bought. So one of the things I have spoken about in the past, and not really speaking about too much today, is that it creates an exploitable diaspora network. One of the things is, even when people want to move, want to be smuggled, or unwittingly get, and then end up being trafficked, or just kidnapped and trafficked to begin with, what ends up happening is you have a marginalized population far from home, who have no rights, nobody really cares about them, and they're exploitable. I mean, that's the whole point, they're exploitable. So if they're exploitable and they usually have family back home, wherever back home is, whether it's Mexico, Fujian province China, Vietnam, the networks go, hey, I'll get you a job in whatever, or let's say you've done good and you now have a job as even, so that's the traffic side, but even as a lawyer working in a port or whatever, they'll say, I know where your kids are back home, or I know where your uncle is back home. So they can often become squeezed into joining a criminal activity, whereas they weren't before. So often by seeing the movements of people, it creates an opportunity for bad guys. And because for them it's business, you have to look at it that way. Okay, so the business of human smuggling, right? Traffickers make $32 billion annually. Here's your annual profit per victim. Sexual exploitation, right? Still the best business regarding people, more than slavery. More than labor, slavery. And as I said, the profit is always in the wealthy countries. There's always a tendency to think, oh, this is something happening in Asia somewhere. It's in the Middle East somewhere, over there. Like somewhere in the ether. No, it isn't. It's like in Newark, New Jersey, and Manhattan or Boston or whatever, because that's where the money is. You see it with humans, as I said. You also see it with all the other illicit goods. So that's why they take them from there into here. So you need to have a sort of an effective an effective standard to deal with it here, but also at its root, and understand where the problem lies. Okay, counterfeits. So the OECD that I'm involved with, that I'm a sub-chair in, the task force, cites counterfeiting at $250 billion per year. The reason why is because, again, it's high profits, low penalties. If you get caught smuggling pharmaceuticals or cigarettes or whatever, like, you usually don't go to prison. And if you do, it's for a short period of time. It's not like smuggling drugs, okay? And so there's a growing movement toward that. And also, there's also demand, because people think, well, it's not really that big a deal, you know, my fake handbag. So who's it hurting? You know, it's just hurting some big corporation that's not, you know, losing so far. It funds terrorism a lot. Everything from food to toothpaste, as I discussed, alcohol and apparel. Here's a mapping of different types of illicit flows, sort of like the other map. Here's, you know, obviously narcotics, right? Here you've got your heroin, here you've got your cocaine, but you've also got people coming through. People come this way through West Africa. There's also quite a lot, actually. I don't know why Dubai isn't here. Dubai is a big problem for a number of things, for humans, but also pretty much any other illicit good, because the goods get repapered there quite a lot, because you've got a very powerful free trade zone. I mean, a lot of huge legitimate business carries on, but it's again that issue of the gray. Here's the cigarette smuggling, all right? So it's the world's most widely smuggled, otherwise legal consumer product, right? They say that 11% of global cigarette sales cost governments more than $40 billion annually in tax revenue. 385 billion illicit cigarettes are smoked annually. There's no, I mean, as if they weren't bad enough for you already, there's really no control over what gets into these other cigarettes. As smuggling, as profitable as drug trafficking, which I said. There's an article in something called SimSec, something Center for International Maritime Security, something like that. Look it up, but they're very good to follow also on Facebook and all of that. You can, contraband shipments that make their way through Syria, Iraq, and Turkey are distributed by smugglers aligned with ISIS. And they move again through the Black Sea into the Bosphorus Strait, coming out of Eastern Europe, in this case Bulgaria. And you know, when you look at these, it's very, very interesting, very geopolitical. There are problems, for instance, during the Cold War, the former Soviet republics, you know, if the security services were involved in smuggling, which is what security services do, smuggling weapons and all that, they suddenly get left without a job. They've still got the connections. So sometimes you see that people who are doing this, or the facilitators, either are currently in government or used to be and have become criminalized because they know their way around. So it's not an amateur's game. This is a very serious business with a lot of geopolitical interests at stake. Sometimes the company is owned by the president of the country, which means you're not going to get enforcement there. Happens a lot. Cigarettes produced in Paraguay, smuggled out into Brazil, Argentina, Colombia, into the US. It comes through the Caribbean, and comes through the Caribbean and is the single, and even into the US, and is the single biggest threat to markets in the Western Hemisphere, is out of Paraguay. And they're also very involved with funding Hezbollah. Okay, leading to a cigarette smuggling operation. One guy who was first sentenced to 155 years. Another company, another bank account owned by another company that's anonymous, and that company has a different ownership, and it's all an LLC, and I mean, all of these things are purposes and things we are entitled to have and are good to have. Privacy rules, and you know, corporate veil of protection. But illicit traders know how to use it very well. So you sort of disguise the ownership by putting it into something else where you have different, you know, a chain of paperwork. And then you take those companies and you put it into something else. Real estate is the classic. Somebody was telling me there are other ways now. Apparently, even video games, is something called World of Warcraft, is now being used as a way to launder money. Apparently it generated its first millionaire a few weeks ago. And I've had heard about something like that and sold that gamers will pay each other real money in order to have, you know, the powers or the services to fight the game. I don't know, I'm not a gamer, so I have to say, the finer points are a little lost on me, okay? Long story short, this is actually happening, and then the people making money off the gaming. And then the money launderers said, there's a play here. We can do this too, and use it as a money laundering thing. So there you go. World of Warcraft is now, real estate is the classic example, World of Warcraft is the sort of new example. So the problem with it, and what always makes it interesting, the kind of thing that makes my heart go pitter-pat, and you know, is when you read the Financial Times and you see that, you know, big bank said, oh, you know, they just got slapped with a multi-billion-dollar punishment, and they said, well, we didn't know. Well, you chose not to know. And this is something that we're working a lot with also in supply chain issues, with the OECD is, you know, there's an increasing mood that as these issues are understood, you can't really turn around and say, oh, I didn't know, and the law doesn't require me to know. You have to know your customer, and if I open a bank account, I have to bring in all sorts of ID, you know, and explain what my business is. But you see that when they fail to monitor lots of wire transactions for $200 trillion, you know, that's an instance of you didn't know because you didn't want to know. Okay, so trade-based money laundering. Thank you, Danielle. Actually found this example that was just a couple of weeks ago. So because the wire transfers and the banks are being monitored more, they're using things like, in this case it was a clothing manufacturer, that they were taking the money from, so you move the drugs, the drugs went from Mexico to the US, you sold the drugs. Now you have piles of American dollars, right? Which now you can't easily transfer back to Mexico, which is where your cartel is, right? So you got to find a way to do that. And doing wire transfers, because of the HSBC thing, is no longer as cool. Because you have to transfer like less than $10,000 at a time, and you know, they're watching. So they were apparently taking the money, taking it to, investing it in a clothing manufacturer, and establishing a, you know, the prepayment for exports, right? The clothing was just sent to Mexico, and then it was sold, when it was sold locally into pesos, they considered that that was a transaction from the dollars into pesos. This is not my area of specialty. I have colleagues who do that, and they sit all day long looking at, wow, you're selling rice at 15 times the market price of rice per bag. Clearly there's something else going on here. And it's not that they're actually moving another illicit good, it's that the paperwork of the bills of lading means that it is covering financial transactions of, so the money is just staying on that side of the border, but they're giving you a piece of paper that on this side of the border you can get your money. So it's a different way of transferring, of wiring the money. And the only way you can do it, to figure this out, is to sit down and read bill of lading after bill of lading. And it's really tedious. It's not something I really want to do. But some people do, and it's a growing way of laundering money because of the difficulty in transferring money now. Lebanese Canadian Bank, you might have heard about this. That unraveled a huge link between also, again, Hezbollah, which I've talked a lot about because I have worked a lot on that, and the Venezuelans, and Colombian cocaine, and the Mexican cartel, and the money going through Lebanese Canadian Bank, and then they bought used cars, which were then shipped to West Africa. And that was the way of, they both smuggled stuff in the cars and then used the transactions. And there was actually some interesting photographs, if you read the details of the case. There are satellite images of these sort of growing car lots in sort of West Africa, and they're just huge. And they're like, what's going on? The cars aren't moving. And that was part of this case. Gotta love a good satellite image. Okay, pyramid of effects. So one of the things that you want to do in this, information sharing, or one of the things that you can launch is, you're always sort of to disrupt, as I said, disrupt the network, degrade its ability to conduct business. These are the slightly more what we call the kinetic route, right? You investigate, you indict, you interdict, you seize, you arrest. But as I said, this is more the policy side, right? The policy, which is very significant. These are not to be taken lightly. These are extremely powerful, because what makes business business is the policies that enable it, right? That make it profitable, that make the routes viable, that make, whether it's the excise tax, the trafficking routes, the ability to move money. Designations are a powerful one. I worked on a case where, if you get designated, it means people still will do business, but then you're sanctioned and it's very hard. You're not supposed to ship, take their money, or do anything with them. So what can be done? This is the final slide I'm done. We talked a lot about supply side disruption. One of the things that I've sort of carried on talking about throughout was the sort of public-private partnership. It's the buzzword of the day. I don't know. They started talking about it at the OECD last year, and 2 weeks ago in Veracruz, Mexico, they said, what we need is a PPP, more PPP, We're like, okay, great. How exactly does that work? There are a number of ways to do it. You can either put, everybody talks about it and pays lip service to it, but nobody really knows how to do it. And government loves to say, we collaborate with industry so well. And they don't, really. They don't. They don't listen to industry. They don't care about industry's problems, by and large. If they say an industry is naive and they're self-serving. So there's like deep suspicion on either side. There's also the, aside from the deep suspicion on either side, industry doesn't want some of its competitive data to be misused, right? And government doesn't want to be seen to be doing industry's bidding, right? If Novartis comes to you and says, hey, I want you to interdict this shipment, here's what we know about it, because we have eyes on the market, so we know stuff that you don't, and we bring you the information. Government is now pretending, and this is the flavor of the month, that yes, bring us your data and we will enforce. First of all, most of the time they don't, unless they see an imminent threat. Second of all, the data is odd, presented by industry. And then third, do you really want, Homeland Security to be viewed as doing Novartis's bidding, right? So there's a problem. So the way to do this is to set up what's called like a connective tissue, something where industry data can be poured in, can be anonymized, is a trusted partner to industry, and also a trusted partner to government, and acts a bit as a buffer, as a connective tissue. It can be anything. It can be an NGO, it can be a separate government entity, it can be a private company. But that needs to be worked out. But anyway, that's the new buzzword in this field. But ultimately, it's always down to consumer awareness, which is something that we try to do. It's not easy. People don't understand what are the consequences of their choices in illicit trade. That when you buy that handbag, when you buy that med, well, medicine, most people prefer not to buy fake medicines. I mean, you like to think, fake handbag is one thing, fake meds, you usually are not. You're pretty unwitting about it. But if they understand what the consequences are, and that it is not a victimless crime, that it is, that it funds all this, horror in the world, that is ultimately what you need to do, is to reduce demand. Because if people want it, it will be supplied, and that's it. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Neumann, for a wonderful presentation. And I think it became more clear for people how big the illicit networks are and how the influence of them is more serious than we think, and that the good guys are losing, actually.
Yeah, they are.
And I think the responses we have here are not that viable, and we don't have a good responses from the governments. And the point you brought here in one of the previous slides that I didn't think about is the convergence of the threats, the terrorist one and the criminal one. And my initial questions before we open the floor to discussion and to questions would be, what is the ultimate objective then of this threat, crime terrorist threat? So if we have terrorism is a power, it strives for power, yes? And crime strives for finances. So what is the crime terror one? What does it strive for, and how does it influence the response?
Thank you. That's an excellent question, and is a point I should have made clearer. Maybe this is a slightly cynical view. I'm not sure it's the, maybe it's not the popular view, but I'm of the firm belief that ultimately, you start with a grievance. Well, terrorist groups start with a grievance, a complaint that they want to see addressed, and then get the money in order to enable them to do that. I saw that first okay. To put simply, what I saw in Colombia, or what I started seeing in Colombia and then saw in other places was, first you get the money to buy the weapons. Okay, that's your concern. And then there's so much money, the weapons are there to guard the money. So it's what I call the grievance to greed, and then transformation, okay, of the narrative. The thing is, grievance is a very, very powerful narrative. And if you travel to areas of conflict, it's always, especially if you travel and are an American, and it's, well, you have to help fund me and give me weapons because they're out to get me, and that affects your interests, and then this, and and every side has a story. And then the ultimate story is, thanks, give me the money, give me the weapons, get out, goodbye. Don't interfere. Okay. But they use the grievance very conveniently becomes a recruitment tool, becomes a way to activate the diasporas, becomes a way to justify the violence, which ultimately becomes a way to regain control. So for me, in my view, as I say, it may not be everybody's view, but I'm very convinced of it, it is increasingly about power and control in both instances. The threat convergence is also referred to, these crime terror pipelines are also referred to as hybrid networks, because they're a little bit of terrorist network, a little bit of crime network. So why this needs to be understood is because if you're confronting a hybrid network, your response needs to be hybrid as well. Taking a counter-terrorist strategy, right? So you have three different things going on, right? Counterterrorism is basically, in a nutshell, in a totally oversimplified way, right? Spy on them, figure out who's in control, kill them, right? Counterinsurgency is what we call clear, hold, build, right? Clear the terrain, hold it, make sure they don't come back, build community relations, keep them happy, keep them from overthrowing you, whatever, okay? Then you have your law enforcement action, which is intercept the shipment, get the indictment, throw them in prison. With these hybrid networks, there's sort of everything is going on. It's a counter-terrorist strategy. They're also regain territory. I mean, you see it with ISIS. It's like hybrid network 3.0, basically, in my view. The ability to control terrain and take over the functions of government enables them to traffic more, which enables them to carry on greater terrorist activities, which enables them to control territory more. So it starts getting into an accelerated growth cycle. So if to counter that, you need to counter all three. So your strategies need to encompass counterterrorism, counterinsurgency, and good old-fashioned law enforcement.